Welcome to Before the Buzzer Conversations, real talk about death, legacy, and what matters most.
I'm Keith, a retired physician.
And I'm Michelle, his daughter, a broadcasting professor.
I'm not dying yet.
Thank God. But even in health, we know death will come, and we need to talk about it.
You know, it's important for parents and their adult children to have those conversations, Michelle.
But it's not always easy to talk about, and that's where we come in.
In this podcast, we'll talk together about what needs to be done before you pass and provide practical ways for you to have these conversations with people in your life.
This is not about doom and gloom. It's about living with purpose, passing on what matters most, and finding peace, even in the unknown.
So before the buzzer sounds, let's have a conversation.
Welcome to the first episode of Before the Buzzer Conversations.
Welcome, everybody.
Oh, Dad, I'm so excited to do this podcast with you. You know, I remember about a year ago, we were walking around a lake in Pine Top, Arizona, and you were telling me about this class you were developing for church. And I kept thinking, I want to talk more about that. And that would be a fun podcast to do. And here we are.
It was really a great idea that you had, because I spent all of that summer really reading and researching and thinking about how we could bring to people that we go to church with conversations about the whole issue that we are going to one day die, where we're going to end up, and the process of living out those last few years with purpose.
Right. And it's something that kind of feels uncomfortable to talk about, but it's so important. And you have been so good about having those conversations with me for some time now. And I loved that you were inspired to share that with other, more of your peers, right? So other people at your age. But I was thinking, for my generation, this is something I want to share with people too, because it's so important for us to be having those conversations, parent and child.
And, you know, I think 40 years as a Christian physician gave me a front row seat to see those individuals and families that did this well, and those that hadn't leaned into these conversations for a variety of reasons, but really made those transitions much more difficult emotionally, spiritually, physically than I thought they could have been.
Well, we are going to get into all of that. But first, listeners, I am so excited to introduce you to my dad, one of my favorite humans. You are a retired family physician. You have more than 40 years of clinical experience, from delivering babies in obstetrics to providing end-of-life care. So really from birth until death.
Cradle to grave.
Cradle to grave, yes. And I remember growing up and, you know, being in the car with you, and your beeper went off and we had to go to the hospital, and I waited in the waiting room while you delivered a baby.
And making rounds with me?
Yes, and making rounds with you. And then when I was pregnant, I would text you nonstop questions about what was going on.
You're still sending me questions about
yes.
your children, my grandchildren.
Yeah, I sent you a picture of a rash the other day. I'm like, tell me about this.
Yeah, exactly.
You are also retired from executive work. I'm going to brag about you. You have an MD and an MBA, and you retired a couple years ago now from an executive C-suite level position for a major health network here in Arizona. So you have a lot of leadership experience as well.
And it was a great opportunity, thank you, Michelle, to really lead a team of a large hospital system through the pandemic, which really taught me quite a bit about teamwork and keeping focus. Really, the needs of the patient and their family are really where we need to focus.
You've also done a lot of research. I remember early on you did a lot of research on reproductive women and how women could. What was it that you did early on?
Well, the whole area of preconception care.
Yeah.
How do men and women prepare their bodies in a healthy way so that if God blesses them with a pregnancy and a child, they have the best opportunity for a healthy outcome.
Awesome. I remember talking about that a lot. And then more recently, you've done some research into mental health and wellness, what kind of overall wellness for people working in the medical field.
Yeah, a real burden over the last 10 years as a physician executive on the woundedness of our physicians and nurses and other allied health, that it's a difficult career. And I think particularly as you go through the pandemic, it's almost a warlike environment. So I've been working with the team a lot on how can we take away some of those areas of friction so the actual delivery of care at the bedside or in the office or in the operating room can really be more focused on the needs of the patient.
And I love that you're taking all those decades of experience and passing that on to the next generation of physicians. Here as your career is sunsetting.
legacy, I think, is important. We spend a lot of time early in our lives really building a resume and building our credibility. But it's so important to be able to mentor and to have a legacy and to leave those lessons behind so that the folks that follow us are in better position to continue to move things forward.
I love that. And in addition to the medical field, you've also been a church leader. I think every church we've ever been to, you've been immediately pegged as someone to put on the elder board, including your current church. So you've always been involved in ministry, adjacent to your work as a physician.
Well, Michelle, as Christ followers, we realize that when we become a believer, God gives us spiritual gift or gifting. Those are supernatural abilities. And I recognized early on through people that were mentoring me that my primary spiritual gifts were administration or leadership and teaching. And so not only in my professional career, but in my ministry career, I've tried to really exercise that special anointment that God gave me and use it to his glory.
I love that. Well, in your personal life, you've been married to Melanie, my mom, for 50 years. This summer, you will celebrate 50 years of marriage. Congratulations.
Well,
what a huge
you.
accomplishment. I'm getting tears in my eyes. It's
love of my life, and we got married right before I started medical school. So this wonderful woman has been on this journey this entire time, and she keeps me humble because she reminds me of those times where though professionally I may be looking better than I really am, that I've had to learn to be a good husband and a great father.
Yes, she's helped behind the scenes. We could do a whole podcast about how she's been influential in both of our lives.
Amen.
And also just shout out to Melanie that she really picked the title for this podcast.
She did,
Yeah.
yes. I love Before the Buzzer Ends here.
Yeah, and it was one of the ones on our list, but she really pushed for this one, and so I'm glad that we did that. You're also dad to me. I'm your only child.
Well, that's a great transition for me to boast about and introduce you, my co-host, Michelle Fortin, her married name. You are a broadcast professor at Grand Canyon University. And that is building upon your industry experience as a producer, a reporter, an anchor in television news in multiple studios around the country. You've been married to my son-in-law, the son I never had, Jason Fortin, for 17 years now. And thank you, through God's blessing, to gift us with two wonderful grandchildren who are tweeners now.
Yes.
And we have all the joys of, as a grandparent, seeing some of the things play out that we experienced with you as you were growing up.
We were just talking about that, how I have a 12-year-old daughter now, and reminiscing about some of the conversations we had when I was 12. But yeah, Dad, I am a broadcasting professor here at GCU. We're actually sitting in the podcast bay where I teach my students, and it's a really fun opportunity for me to come and put into practice what I teach in our broadcasting classes. We're launching a broadcasting major here at GCU. It's really exciting, and yes, it's an opportunity for me to build upon what I did in news and pass what I've learned on to the next generation of journalists, broadcasters. So it's really a fulfilling career, and I love that we're doing this podcast because it really does blend our two skill sets. You have the expertise in the area that we'll be discussing on this podcast. I have the expertise in interviewing and the technical side of things. So this is an exciting opportunity to blend our skill set and really have a good conversation and do something together that is a blessing to both of us.
Well, thank you. And, I don't kid about this. As people ask me what my daughter does, I boast about what I just introduced. But I also say that you've been my really internal speech coach for my career. As my career and my leadership moved on, more and more public speaking was required, and you have helped me mature in my ability to communicate. So that I really appreciate. It's a good return on my investment for your education.
Yes, and that's going to pay off for me too, because the better you talk, the less editing I have to do.
Amen.
So you're on your toes. So this is a mini-series podcast. We have 6 episodes all planned out, and we are leaving space for a 7th episode where we'll answer listener questions and perhaps discuss other aspects of this topic that you, the listener, suggest. And we'll get into the first episode here soon, but the premise will be about why. Why talk about death is the title, and while we'd all like to pretend death isn't coming for us, it is, and for our loved ones. So why should we talk about it?
In episode 2, Longing for Heaven is theologically heavy. We'll discuss what happens after death, what eternal life is like, and why having that perspective will better enable the concept of dying well.
Dying Well is the title of episode 3, and that will go into what it means, how dying has changed over the last 500 years, and how our society should do it better.
Episode 4 will be about preparing and sharing our legacy. We'll go over 3 big things: what you must do, should do, and could do, focusing primarily on that last one. What you could do to leave a legacy of love for your family as you prepare to die and after you pass away.
Episode 5 is about community. We'll talk about how to support people dealing with loss, but also preparing for the community surrounding you or your loved one when they pass. Does your mom want an open or closed door policy? And what's best from a spiritual perspective?
The final prepared episode we have is episode 6, Grief, Lament, and Hope. We'll discuss what grieving looks like from a physical, emotional, and spiritual perspective. From both sides of this topic, those who are preparing to pass and those being left behind.
And like we mentioned, we're leaving room to come back for a 7th episode to discuss additional topics and or answer your questions. And you can shoot us a message via the link in our show notes, and we would love to hear from you. Well, our first conversation, this podcast episode titled Why Talk About Death? So we based the content of our podcast on a class that you developed for your church, and that was based on a book called Preparing for Glory. And I know you brought it with you today, and we want to talk a little bit about that because that really was the impetus for all of this.
Terrific book that was published in the spring of 2024 by Elizabeth Reynolds Turnage, called Preparing for Glory. And I like the way Elizabeth had put this whole concept together. And with her permission, I used that as an outline for developing this class that we did at our church. And therefore, it's a bit of a template for our conversation that we're having today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this book really is great. It's really outlined very well and explains things in an easy-to-digest format. And we will link to that book in our show notes in case you want to go and get a copy. It would be a great book to read alongside the podcast, and also maybe for some more in-depth thought on some of the things we're not going to have a chance to touch on. Also would be a great gift to give to someone in your life that you want to have this conversation with.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. And as we'll get into, because we're both Christ followers, the thing I like about Elizabeth's book, that it is biblically solid and really is consistent with what we know from the scriptures, which we'll get into in a few moments. There's a lot of great reading out there, but often it's not anchored to biblical truth. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing this podcast, is to make sure that as we live this life, we're living it to God's glory.
Mm-hmm. So, Dad, why do you think it's important for Christians to thoughtfully engage with the topic of death, not just when it's upon you, but now?
Well, we reach back to the wisdom of Solomon, right, in Ecclesiastes, to every season, beautifully written poetry back at that time, and we realize there's a time to be born and a time to die. Solomon reminded us, the wisest man that ever lived. And, you know, I do think that is beautiful, a gift that our life is, and we see that in the birth of a new baby and all the wonderful milestones that we experience, and even the reversals of life that help us to grow. There is that season where God's going to call us home, and we don't want to overly dwell on it, but I think if we stick our head in the sand, it's a disservice to not only our lives, but to the legacy and memory that we want to leave behind. So that's part of the purpose of us having this conversation.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier how good you've been about having this conversation with me for years. Part of that being because you are a planner. If you're into the Enneagram, my dad's an Enneagram 1, so he is a big planner. But this is, really, I still don't like talking about it. It's not something that makes me happy to think about you passing on. But it is important, and I respect and appreciate the thought that you've put into your own passing someday. But what? Have you had any hopes or hesitations on that topic? Have you wrestled with anything emotionally in your own life that maybe you haven't shared with me?
Well, I think like everybody, when you're younger, this is something you don't tend to think a lot about. There's death occurring around you. But I think particularly when you're in clinical medicine and you see things that happen, not only older people dying of chronic disease or cancer, whatever that is, but you also see some tragic younger lives. You realize that tomorrow is a gift and we're not promised tomorrow. And I think as I have matured and now moved into my 70s and I have that experience and I'm closer to heaven, obviously, than I was 10 years ago, I have a more sober perspective on this, in a sense that, again, not a heaviness, but a joy that God has given my wife and I. This 50 years of marriage, and we had the gift of seeing our grandchildren starting to head toward their adulthood. So I think in many ways, both as a clinician and personally experiencing some health setbacks over the years has helped me maybe have a more balanced, sober view of this topic.
Mm-hmm. I didn't ask your permission before I'm about to ask this next question, so we can edit this out if you want to. But you had a health scare a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Are you okay talking about that?
Sure.
Okay, so you had cancer,
mm-hmm.
and you have come out on the other side. Praise God on that. But did that experience did that help you think about this, or did that prompt some of this in your mind?
Yeah, I think it did. And, as you know the story, I mean, and part of my overall testimony, if you will, is that I started my career with a wife at the age of 25 diagnosed with ovarian cancer, just as a brand new physician. So I started my career as the spouse of a cancer survivor, and as you mentioned, 10 years ago, I myself had an advanced form of prostate cancer diagnosed. I went through all the treatment. I got to be that physician who now got to be a patient and really experiencing the terrific healthcare teams that we have, and how not only their clinical expertise, which has allowed me now to live another 10 years, but the compassion that they showed in the care. And it really has helped me lean into these conversations, be more open with people, and I think have a more sensitive, empathetic ear. There's something about the difference between sympathy, where you're really trying to come alongside somebody that you haven't personally had the experience, and now having had the experience as a cancer survivor myself, it just opens up some wonderful conversations that hopefully aren't that threatening.
I would imagine, though, as a physician having a cancer diagnosis, there's a lot of things that as a layman I wouldn't understand, but you understand really the severity. Maybe you could read between the lines, or you don't even need to read between the lines. You could read your own medical records and know what they're telling you or not telling you. Mm-hmm. That must be sobering. And did, you had a more advanced case, you responded well to the treatment, all that, but was there a time in there that you thought, this might be it?
Yeah, very much so. And, you might recall that when I learned the diagnosis, and I'm not making this up, I never had the thought, why me? The immediate thought I'm sure that God gave me was, why not me? I know the science. I know this may be my ticket to go home to heaven, or it may be something I survive and I can use as a springboard for these conversations. It's been amazing over the last 10 years how many men, particularly when I share that, open up some of their fears in this topic, because it's the second or third most prevalent cancer in North America. So it's been a real blessing for me.
Why not me? Gosh, if more people had that attitude when they get a diagnosis like this, I think it really would change people's perspective. And that's really what we're going to get. I don't want to tease too much, but then we're going to get into that a lot and throughout the series. But not why me, why not me? Oh, I love that. Oh my goodness. And why my dad? Why not my dad? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, because I remember the day you told me you had the diagnosis. We had a lunch date at True Food Kitchen, and you told me, and it was devastating. But
heavy.
Yeah, very heavy. Very heavy. But also, these conversations that we're having in this podcast, we're trying to encourage our listeners to have as well with their children and with their parents. Prior to your diagnosis, we had already talked about this. You had already told me your wishes and your plans, and you had everything in order. So even that heavy news felt like you had prepared me. If this was your ticket home, as you say, I still felt a level of strength. Mm-hmm. I can do this. I can advocate for you. I can stand by your side. I know what your wishes are. And I was already equipped. We weren't forced to have that conversation in that difficult moment, because we had already had that conversation many times before. And that's my fear of my peers. They haven't had those conversations, and they're going to get that tough diagnosis. They're going to go on a lunch date with their dad and hear this heavy news. They're not going to feel that sense of, oh, yep, I can stand by his side and advocate for him because I know what his wishes are. because they don't know. And so my hope is that people will take this conversation and really use it as a catalyst. So
it's just funny how, life experiences, the most painful things in our life often are the shaping experiences. As you remember, my father died a week before my 30th birthday. He was in his early 50s, died suddenly, had really underprepared for my mom, your grandmother, and her next 10 years as a widow financially. And so it was a mess. And I'm the firstborn, and I kind of watched it unfold. We supported my mom through that transition. But I thought to myself, I am not going to repeat this because statistically, I'll go before my wife in all probability. And I want to really make sure that I have an off-ramp that is much more supportive than my dad. Again, he wasn't expecting, none of us expect to die, when it happens suddenly.
I never thought about that. That, yeah, you really did have, I've thought often about how your parents died pretty young, and how you've outlived them, thank God. But yeah, your dad, he did die suddenly, and he was on a business trip. I mean, it was really sudden. It wasn't sick for a long time, nothing like that. And how, your mom, remember you had to step in and help your mom financially and all those things. And yeah, that really must have shaped your outlook. And that you're a natural planner, you kind of kicked it into high gear.
Yes, exactly. Oh. And it helped me clinically as well, have these conversations over the course of decades of taking care of patients.
Okay, so these conversations, we've been having them for years, and I know that that's not the normal conversation a lot of parents and children have. I think it strengthens our relationships, and it can deepen those interpersonal relationships when you talk about this. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, don't we have a tendency just to talk about the news, weather, and sports? So as we lean into the more philosophic or deeper issues, even if we don't agree, even if we have some difficult perspectives on this, it does really deepen relationships, doesn't it, Michelle?
Yeah, I agree. I think I always love to go deep. I mean, I can have a conversation with a wall. I mean, I've always been good at conversation and love asking questions. But even with some people in my life, like my in-laws, for example, like I've hesitated to go here. It is uncomfortable, and they're not necessarily comfortable with going deep. But you have set that tone in our relationship. So it obviously is somewhat based on the interpersonal dynamics between two people. But when you share vulnerabilities, like your fear of dying, your fear of what happens next, or you're facing a diagnosis and you're scared, when you share that vulnerability with someone and they reciprocate and they say, yeah, your diagnosis scares me too, I don't want to live without you, that immediately the shared vulnerability is going to deepen the relationship. And so even if it's not a relationship that naturally tends toward being deep and philosophical, like you said, even that can be a catalyst to really taking it to that next level, which is what we really hope people do.
Absolutely. And we have to love people where they're at. I mean, and I think that vulnerability is really important, and we'll get more into in future recordings in this podcast process, maybe on some tools, particularly, Michelle, for your cohorts, your generation, that perhaps don't have a natural way to have this conversation with a parent or a grandparent, that maybe some ways that you can get into that. But you're right, we don't really get deep unless there's shared vulnerability, that there's psychological safety, that we can talk about these things without shame or judgment, and really sort of love people where they're at, because, we all sort of have those areas that are difficult to pull back the curtain.
Right. And I mean, death, even though it's something we all know with certainty is going to happen to all of us, it's still something we don't want to talk about.
Yes.
And so, knowing that we all have, no matter how comfortable we are with each other, we all have some level of uncomfortableness on this topic. So that leads me to the next thing I wanted to ask you is, you hear a study on death. Like, why would I want to enroll in a class about that? Why would I want to pick up a book about that? Why would I want to listen to a podcast? It talks about something that makes me uncomfortable. So can you explain a little bit more about the heart behind, like, why we should be doing that?
Well, again, I go back to my lived life experience as primarily a clinician, and just observing those individuals and those families that did this well, that I learned from, that I cried with, that I prayed with, that I had the opportunity to go to a funeral afterwards and celebrate a life well lived. And then those families, for a variety of reasons, that struggled with this, that hadn't thought about this, and were in the critical care unit and making some difficult decisions about what's too much care, what's not enough care. And again, those are challenging times, but I think if you haven't had a little bit of a sense of what the blueprint looks like to sort of hang some of those tough decisions off of, boy, that really makes it difficult when there's all that emotion that gets infused into the situation.
Yeah. We said that this isn't about fear, right? This is about meaning, legacy, living with heaven in view. Can you unpack that a little bit without giving too much away for future episodes?
Yeah. Well, again, the Bible has a lot of truth in it around what we are looking forward to in the eternal state. There are no more tears. There's no pain. I'm out of business as a physician, right? It's a time of worship and perfection in a glorified body. That's what we have to look forward to. These bodies, just like an old car, are wearing down, and we'd like to keep that thing going as long as we can. But there does come a time when we transition.
Right. And no matter where you are in life, you can imagine that. Like, we are aging, and I'm feeling it too. This has really been a great conversation to get things started. It's been hard to not talk about some of the things that we have set to talk about later. We just wanted to thank everybody for listening to this first episode of our podcast about Before the Buzzer Conversations. We covered a lot of ground about who we are, Dad and I, and why we're doing this. But why are you listening? Is there someone in your life you'd like to have these conversations with, but maybe you're hesitant? We just unpacked that a little bit about why that's natural and normal, and you shouldn't feel shame about that. But one thing that might be really easy is to send them a link to this podcast and let them listen to this and let us help you start your own Before the Buzzer conversation.
Well, in our next episode, we're going to tackle some tough questions about death. Why do we die? What really happens when we die? Do we become angels?
Do we?
Well, tune in next time to find out.